Final Fantasy is one of those franchises I've always had a strong connection to. From my early days in gaming until now, there is something inherently fun about exploring the worlds Square Enix creates. But back in 2004, one of the most unique Final Fantasies I've ever experienced released, Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. The various classes, the level design, and just the overall feel made it something different from much of what had come before. After all, at the time, Final Fantasy had mostly stayed on Sony systems, but this return to Nintendo really experimented with what they could do. And although it was an incredible new world, it was hampered by the need for 4 Game Boy Advances and 4 link cables in order to enjoy it at its best with multiplayer. But 16 years later, can the Remastered Edition fully capture what made it so special while making the multiplayer more accessible? Well, yes and no, but we'll break it down as we move along. The player's journey begins on the Tippa Peninsula, where it's up to them to travel across the land to collect a special substance known as Mir. This powers up your crystal, which helps keep the dangerous miasma that covers the continent at bay. There are 4 different races to choose from, each with their own attributes. The human-like Clavat have the best defense, the small Lilty race has the best offense, the mysterious Yuke race with the best spellcasting, and the animal-like Selkies, who specialize in speed. I decided on a Selkie as they had good offense and defense to match their speed. That being said, it is easy to dip your toes in all the options, as you're allowed to make up to 8 characters, which you can freely switch between at any given time. For veterans, there are even new types for each class and gender to play with, increasing the amount to 5 and allowing for a more diverse-looking party. While the premise is intriguing enough, it's also apparent that this isn't as story-focused as other Final Fantasy games. The world itself isn't all that big, with 8 different areas making up the bulk of your travels. Upon entering each level, you receive a fragment of its storied past before diving into the gameplay. In addition, there are many chances to meet other characters along your travels as they appear at random intervals. They may be other traveling groups giving you pieces of advice, a gang trying to steal your items, or a very hopeless dreamer. There are a few critical moments that come along, but for the most part, it is mostly fluff to flesh out the world. However, because you have zero control over said intervals, they may not come at the best of times and even halt your progress at moments. I like that these interactions are there, but randomness is what really makes them more of an annoyance. The gameplay loop is rather straightforward. Players enter a level for a Mir drop, you will fight your way through enemies, collect loot, and fight a boss at the end to wrap it all up. But you must keep a special chalice with you at all times, as it not only keeps the deadly miasma at bay, but it is what holds the Mir drops. Each level fills the chalice by a third, and by filling it 3 times, a year in the cycle comes to a close, and we'll get a recap of what occurred over that last year. Completing years grants you new routes, harder levels, and even better treasure. With only 14 dungeons being offered, players will have to go back to previous dungeons multiple times to get everything out of the experience. Luckily, it's not the same each time, as harder enemies and obstacles are introduced each time, making that second or even third trip feel unique. You'll need to play those harder dungeons again though, in order to receive the better rewards. Not only is it necessary to take on the final dungeon, which is no joke, it's how your character gets stronger. There are no levels or experience points in Crystal Chronicles. Instead, some of the treasures you find in the dungeons are artifacts or scrolls. However, you can only choose one artifact from the pool you've gathered at the end of the dungeon, making it potentially necessary to repeat it and reap all the rewards that you want. The artifacts can grant additional strength, defense, health, a new command slot, or even permanently unlocking magic like Cure. On the other hand, the scrolls provide designs for armor and weapons that can then be equipped by your character. Naturally, you'll need money and the right materials, not to mention a blacksmith, to actually make the equipment, which can be found in most towns. The towns themselves are nothing that interesting, but I found myself only visiting for the items and upgrades, never bothering to talk to the NPCs. Despite offering some pretty brutal challenges, the action RPG trappings are kept relatively simple. Attacking is done with a single button, with combos performed by tapping in the proper rhythm. However, by holding the attack button down, a focus attack is unleashed, though it takes some time. How much you use each depends on the race you've chosen. As a Selkie, I could charge my focus attacks faster than anyone else and felt comfortable with my playstyle. In addition to standard attacks, spells can be found in the form of Magicite. Magicite must be found during the dungeon, but it is quite plentiful and allows the player to add a magic attack to their command slot. It must be charged in the same way as a focus attack and could help in a pinch depending on your race. It can also be powered up in multiplayer when your teammates all use magic on the same spot, creating a sense of unity and coordination to the gameplay. And yeah, that is pretty much all the attacks you can really do. There is a defend option that I never used, finding it easier to just move out of the way. Plus, it doesn't help that it's a separate command slot. I wish it had been made its own button or been made into a more impressive dodge roll. It seems like an unfortunate oversight in an action RPG to not make the defensive options at least a little fun. It's not like this couldn't have been changed, as there are plenty of buttons to choose from. But of course, the true draw of Crystal Chronicles is the multiplayer. Gone is the local option with GBAs and link cables in favor of a completely online experience. But this feels like such an odd choice since all the characters need to remain on the same screen anyway due to the protective aura of the chalice. There are some unique events for each player, such as a personal goal for the dungeon that is only displayed on their screen, but it feels like a missed opportunity to make a truly fantastic local option. So unless you're playing online, you're playing alone, which isn't as fun. Rather than a member of the party carrying the chalice, a friendly Moogle handles it while you fight and solve puzzles. It gets the job done, but more aggravating is the likely potential of being overwhelmed by monsters. Thankfully, there are plenty of checkpoints and an autosave, but I still found myself utterly frustrated in single player. Unfortunately, online turns out to be not a great option either, as it has one of the worst systems for any game in recent memory. Players will have to add friends through an invite code system, which makes sense given the crossplay nature of Crystal Chronicles Remastered. The fact that it doesn't recognize your system level friends, however, is a bit sad. The situation worsens when you realize that you need to be on the same part of the map to play together. If I'm far into the game and have no way of going back to an earlier section, we can't start playing until that is sorted out. And considering the mere progress is only saved for the host, it makes the whole situation just worse. But this is made even more frustrating because it simply won't allow you to stay in a party. Every time a level is beaten, you have the option to replay it or dissolve the party. Why is that a thing, especially when the replay option is listed as continue? So essentially, if I want to play with a friend through a series of levels, we have to disconnect and reconnect between each one. It takes way more coordination than is necessary and drags down the multiplayer experience completely. Once the multiplayer has begun, the game works well enough. The characters sometimes move a bit wonky on the server side, but I never had any massive issues overall. And there are some good ideas, such as players getting their own unique items from chests. The basic gameplay is great in multiplayer, it's just a hassle to get to. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Remastered Edition looks quite good on Nintendo Switch. While it doesn't have any major texture work done to it, the game's style makes it more than pleasing. The dungeon variety is still something I'm impressed with to this day, and in fact, the game runs super smooth with no slowdown, regardless of how you play. The music also remains one of the game's strong suits. The Renaissance theme really helps to sell the world at large and makes for a robust Final Fantasy soundtrack. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Remastered Edition left me extremely torn with how it turned out. The single player isn't ideal, and the multiplayer is more complicated than it needs to be. But once I started going through the motions, I really got into it. Some of the mechanics haven't aged that well, namely the defense options, but the charm of the adventure still stands as an incredible achievement. It has a flair that is unique in the Final Fantasy franchise, and makes it worth experiencing at least once. Overall though, I just barely liked it. Its missteps bring it down, but the core gameplay is unique and fun enough that I stayed invested for its 20 hours of playtime. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to Game Explained for more on Final Fantasy and other things gaming.